Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a fabulous story tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the Canadian weather forecaster had warned it was going to rain, and advised folk to have their umbrellas at the ready, but I hadn't paid the forecaster much heed or attention, as on way too many occasions to count, the forecaster got the weather so horribly wrong. I had happily skipped rather nonchalantly out of the front door, with a small bag flung very casually over my narrow shoulders. I may have been in my early 30s, but some people thought I was a teenager, which could be oddly frustrating, although many believed I was lucky to look so young for my age. They said that by the time I got to being 80 years old, I might look as if I was in my 60s. I'm not sure it works exactly like that, but here's hoping. I knew carrying the golfing umbrella would be a laborious task for one as slight as myself, so I left it behind, not believing for a single second that I would get caught up in the rain. Unfortunately, I didn't have a small umbrella in my possession to keep in my purse, as the last one I owned I had been forced to toss aside, as it got buckled up by a fierce oncoming wind when it had been pouring down with rain. So if it did rain today, well, I had no reinforcements at my disposal, but why should I worry about it? I wasn't going to get caught in the rain, I persuaded myself for the 5,000th time. I contentedly sashayed down the road to the Peter Pan nursery school to pick up my little boy Harry, who was close to turning 5 years old and was too young for kindergarten at this stage, which was why he attended a nursery or preschool, if you like. The great thing about the Peter Pan nursery school is that they offered an after-nursery care service for working parents such as myself, so that the children could be picked up later in the afternoon at the earliest convenience, while they were supervised by the nursery school teacher, so they were kept busy and entertained throughout the day. I enjoyed taking advantage of this service, and I also thoroughly enjoyed the walk every afternoon to pick up my son from nursery. It was a quintessential opportunity to take some light-hearted exercise and enjoy some fresh air in this prepossessing Toronto neighbourhood. Besides, I always liked the walk back home. It was fun to enjoy a chat with my little son. He would tell me what he'd got up to at nursery and what games he'd played with his little friends. I was fortunate to be a freelance photographer by profession, so I made absolutely certain that my schedule fitted around my son. So by the late afternoon he was all mine and had my undivided attention, and I could spend quality time with him. Harry had grown up without a father, as the man I dated for a mere 3 weeks, who had made me pregnant, refused to acknowledge that he could have possibly have become a father in such a short space of time. He didn't realize it takes one moment of intimacy to make a baby. I think the man was in complete denial, as I was telling him something he just did not want to hear. I was like the woman emerging from the woodwork like a termite, telling him he was a father. I think he wanted to put that idea to rest as quickly as he possibly could. I do remember he implied that I was clandestinely, cunningly setting him up to take responsibility for some other man's child. I decided that if this was his stinky attitude, it was just as well if he had no input in our lives, so I never contacted him again about the matter, although I sneakily suspect, underneath the layers of his abject denial, he probably did know that he might be my child's father. I wouldn't want Harry to grow up knowing his father refused to acknowledge him as his own progeny. No child needs an insouciant, attached father like that, as I believe that could only mess him up emotionally. The sky had been a delightful cup of blue that morning. The sun had beamed down on me, brushing its magnanimous warmth across my shoulders, so I was basking in its pleasing sensation. The houses showily paraded themselves rather immodestly down our street, like swanky catwalk models that knew that they looked good and weren't afraid to flaunt it either. They were in good shape, most of them were in excellent condition, having been well maintained by their punctilious owners. Most of the front yards boasted proud displays of summer perennials, while the verdant lawns were meticulously mown, and hedges were fastidiously shaped and trimmed, some with a rather artistic prowess. I could see a couple of landscaping vans leaving our neighbourhood. Their services were in high demand on our street. I know this because I regularly made use of their services, although from time to time my brother Marcus would keep the yard looking great. The only house that stood out rather like a shark's fin in an ocean was Mr. Booth's house, that looked as if it hadn't received a lick of paint in many years. I did know that Mr. Booth was a couch potato, that never liked to lift a finger or to do anything that required very much effort. It was like he was the sloth of our neighbourhood, who would hang upside down and watch the world pass him by, if you know what I mean. He was the type that lightly would put off today what he could do tomorrow, and the trouble is when you embrace such procrastination, things never ever get done. Regretfully, Mr. Booth's house was dilapidated and falling apart, and let's just say many a pretentious resident was not remotely happy about the eyesore on our street, with its overlong grass, its tangle of weeds in the front yard, and the untamed, burgeoning, tumble-down creepers that were artfully climbing the walls and creeping through any crack that would find its way into the house. There was an old 1940s rusted car parked in the front yard that looked like it was only good enough for scrap metal. Many believed Mr. Booth's eyesore, which they were sure would bring down the property values of their houses in the street, was an abomination. It was an ugly blotch on the landscape, like a nasty stain on your linen that you cannot wash out. The irony is that Mr. Booth was a retired lawyer, had plenty of money in his bank account to make the suitable changes to his home that would have been affordable for him. But his perennial laziness had invariably postponed any projects that might have transformed that pile of rubble he had the audacity to call his home into a pleasing property indeed, that could potentially be a great investment if he'd only look after the place. Some people surmised that Mr. Booth was penny pinching and didn't enjoy spending money at the best of times, and I do suspect that there might have been truth to these rumours. Either way, if the house continued its rapid descent into decline and decay like a rotting tooth in the gums, Mr. Booth might not be able to keep his house for very much longer. I myself lived in an old Victorian that was divided into two properties. One part of the house was mine. The other part belonged to my neighbours, a young couple called the Fenters, who were hard-working, from the local university, and looked very studious, always wore sensible clothes and glasses, and would leave their house on the back of their bicycles every morning, determined to do their bit to save the environment. I understood they were both strict vegans, refused to wear leather shoes, and only used cleaning products that were environmentally friendly and stripped of all nasty chemicals to clean their home. I do recall once wearing a fake fur jacket on a rather unfriendly, freezing cold winter's morning that looked astonishingly real. By all accounts, the fearsome, rather ferocious look that Mrs. Fenter directed at me that morning could quite literally have exterminated an entire field of cows in a single second, without needing a slaughtering house to turn them into beef. She was trying to hold back her disquieted expression from me with very little success. For some reason I felt like that kid that had been caught with my hand in the candy jar. I felt I owed her an explanation, as if I had to almost apologize for what I was wearing, to redeem myself in her eyes, and reassure her I didn't go around murdering animals for their pelts, which is exactly how Mrs. Fenter would have seen it. "You're looking at my coat," I said with a light chuckle. "This old thing, it's just a fake. I wouldn't wear a real fur coat for a second." Mrs. Fenter had walked over to me. She examined my coat thoroughly, running her fingers down the synthetic fibre. "It's a very good fake, I have to admit," she said, looking suspiciously at my coat. And then she sighed with abject relief. "I'm sorry if I glared at you earlier, but women who wear animal pelts, well, I'd personally like to skin them alive myself. They should be ashamed of themselves. See how they like it. Nothing upsets me more than women who buy luxurious fur coats for the purposes of fashion.
that they have stolen off the back of some of our most beautiful wild animals that should be wearing those coats themselves. Do these self-centered, vainglorious people even stop to consider the poor animal in question that died on their accounts? They gave up their life to support the extreme vanity of someone who buys that coat. She shook her head furiously. I don't think they care, do they? All they care about is how great they look. Well, if you can buy fake furs as good as the one you're wearing, there is no need for anybody to wear the real thing, is there?
My thoughts exactly, Mrs. Fenter. If you can get a good fake fur, why do you need a real one?
Very well put, my dear, and I'm very glad to hear you say it. I'd better be going.
Let's just say we had a vast selection of different characters living down our street that were as varied as the tropical birds you find in the South American rainforest. I casually scooted down the street, hearing the occasional dog bark and sneakily looking into people's yards to admire their perennial flower beds. When I reached Mr. Booth's rather offensive-looking home, I took one look at the grubby exterior of the crumbling ruin and practically squirmed as I saw a pile of bin liners had popped open outside his front door. Didn't he even have the foresight to take him to the bin? Was he really that lazy? There was a large, mangy-looking dog scavenging in the bags, spreading the contents all over the place, littering Mr. Booth's entire front yard, so that I could smell rotting vegetables everywhere. The rancid smell was so disgusting, I very nearly gagged. I had never seen the mysterious dog before, but I immediately guessed it had to be a stray. But anybody could see it was ravenously hungry, doing its damnedest to survive. It looked to be a mix of a retriever and husky, but when it saw me, it looked at me through frightened dark eyes, as if it had been abused by a human before, and had no trust for the human species. It scooted away hurriedly. Poor thing, I thought. It was so dreadfully emaciated, with bones that were sticking out of its rib cage like sharp dagger-like needles that were so obtrusively prominent it was actually scary to see. In truth, the dog looked as if it should not have been even alive. That was how painfully thin he was. I'd been thinking of getting little Harry a dog. He'd asked for one for long enough, and a dog like that would be a lovely companion to bring into our home. And when people popped over to the house to have their photographs professionally done by me, it would be good to have a friendly dog around to welcome them. A dog with a wagging tail and a happy bark. That dog would be absolutely perfect for us, and I could see it desperately needed a home and a family's love. Would I get a chance to find it again? The poor thing was so frightened. I glanced up and down the street to look for the dog, but I saw no sign of it, or anyone else for that matter. As was expected, Eleanor Madison's white net curtains began to flinch as I walked past. I suspected she was having a jolly good look at me. Her house was prominently situated on the edge of the street. I guess she got a bird's-eye view of everything and everyone that walked past. She probably liked it that way. I wasn't remotely surprised. Everyone knew her to be the quintessential snoop, that liked putting her nose into people's business. She had strong opinions about everything. If there was something worth knowing, you can bet your bottom dollar Mrs. Madison knew all about it. People like her were useful, as 20 years ago we didn't exactly have much CCTV footage, so she was the perfect neighborhood watch. Back in the day, she would impress you with the details she retained. It was thanks to her steely powers of observation that she was able to tell Mr. Booth who in the neighborhood had been sending him nasty notes in the post, telling him he was not welcome here and needed to get away from the neighborhood. It was on this unassuming, predictable weekday in our neighborhood that mainly consisted of young families or career-orientated people who spent the lion's share of their day at work and only arrived home at about 5 or 6 o'clock in an evening. But there was always a lot of activity in the street on a Saturday, with people walking their dogs, riding bicycles, tending dutifully to their front yards. I couldn't help thinking that if anyone was around who had heard the formidable weather forecast predicting heavy showers, they'd probably saliently buried themselves into their homes for the next few hours. Maybe they were cooking something, or possibly reading a book. To be fair, I had just seen old Mr. Curtis Barry walking his retired greyhound down the street.
The trouble with Mr. Barry was that the man was so deaf and hard of hearing that whenever you talked to him, he'd put his hand on his ear and shout back, "What was that you said? What were you saying, love? Sorry, I didn't hear you." I know he wore a hearing aid, but I'm not sure if he ever put the damn thing on. You'd have to repeat yourself over and over again, and then he'd go off into a tangent onto a completely different topic of conversation, as he had not heard you in the very first place. So if you were talking about the weather being good, for example, he might think you were talking about his wife being a good cook, and before you knew it, you had been standing there for a couple of hours with him on the street corner, discussing the various dishes his wife made. "Oh, you're talking about my Angie, are you not? Yes, she's an excellent cook, is my Angie. One of the reasons I actually married the woman. My father used to tell me, if you can find a good woman who can cook, you're set up for life, my son. He wasn't wrong about that, you know. Marrying Angie is the very best thing that I ever did. Never regretted it for a single moment. And on top of it all, that woman has got a good heart. Do you know what her secret is to making the quintessential best meatloaf you have ever tasted?" And before I knew it, I'd be given a step-by-step recipe by the well-meaning man. I raised my hand and waved at him before he had a chance to stop and casually meander to my side of the road. I could see his brown bird-like eyes looking eager, as if he was hopefully anticipating a good old chinwag with me. The last thing I needed was to be held up in the traffic congestion of one of his tediously boring conversations yet again, or be given another recipe for meatloaf. Besides, I needed to get to the Peter Pan nursery as soon as I could. I had arranged to have coffee with Harry's nursery school teacher, Mrs. Hancock, after the nursery closed for the day. The Peter Pan nursery school was hemmed in by this bright balustrade fencing, painted in pale pinks, pale blues, greens, yellows and oranges. There were cute little ducks painted all over the walls, and a picture of Peter Pan himself at the front entrance of the school. In the backyard of the nursery school you could see jungle gyms, swings, sand pits and paddling pools. There was a printed sign dangling from the front violet-coloured gate that read, "Peter Pan Nursery School, Welcome." I opened the squeaky gate and sashayed down the stone path, glancing very briefly at my watch. I was 10 minutes early, but as my mother always used to say, "The early bird catches the worm," and I'd always abided by that principle. On seeing me once I entered the classroom, Mrs. Hancock, who was bent over a child's painting, looked up at me and came rushing over to me, wearing her long tweed pencil skirt and white blouse. She had a Mary Poppins look about her, and her bright-spirited warm eyes were always both attentive and friendly. "Hello there, Miss Mackintosh. How are you?" "I'm fine," I said. "We're about to clear up after our painting, aren't we, kids?" she said, clapping her hands together. She was looking after 10 children that afternoon. The vast majority of them had obviously returned home after lunch. The remaining children, who had working parents and were being picked up later, were still with her. "I want you all to wash up your paint brushes and your trays and the glass bottles and put them back neatly. Do you understand?" "Yes, Miss Hancock," the kids chorused together. I watched them industriously lining up at a large sink to wash away the excess of their paint. Mrs. Hancock smiled at me, a warm, genuine, kind smile that met her bright eyes. "Your Harry has done a delightful picture today, which he tells me he painted especially for you, Miss Mackintosh. Come and take a look at it. He's been inspiring all the children today with his bright, ingenious ideas. The paintings today are a tad on the unusual side, featuring some rather idiosyncratic additions thanks to your son. But I'm sure little Harry will put you well into the picture about that." I raised a quizzical brow. "Is that right? Sounds interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing this picture." "Well," said Mrs. Hancock, pointing to my son, "Harry's over there in the far corner. He's sharing a table with little Jack over there. Go and take a look at his lovely painting. I'll be with you shortly." The children all looked up at me curiously as I walked around their childlike plastic tables and tiny chairs, that ranged from yellow to pink and blue. I curiously examined their pictures. The kids had painted with an enthusiastic gusto. The one thing about little children that I noticed after becoming a mother myself is they're not remotely inhibited about what they paint. They go for it so naturally, not being clouded by reticence, uncertainty, or self-doubt. If they're asked to draw a tiger, they won't consider whether they know how to paint one or not. They'll just take the plunge, without recruiting the reservation we adults tend to do. As when we get older, it's easy for us to shrink away and just say, "I can't possibly do it." Everyone wanted me to look at their pictures. I naturally oohed and ahed the way you do over children's expressive artwork, as if they were all aspiring Picassos. Or to be fair, some of the pictures were really, really good. I was naturally biased as far as Harry was concerned, as I believed his painting was the best, but I would say that because I'm his mother. "Look what I've done, Mummy," he said to me proudly, his eyes dancing with merriment. He slipped his tiny little hand in mine, that was surprisingly cold, and led me over to the picture he had painted, that was lying flat against the table. The boy called Jack, who was sharing a table with him, was cleaning up after himself fastidiously, and gave me a warm, indulgent smile. "Look, Mummy," said Harry excitedly. "This is the picture I painted. This is you standing outside our house, and this is me. The Fenters live over there." I bent down to examine Harry's painting more closely. "What is that big thing flying in the air?" I asked him, pointing to this big brown bulky thing, taking up a huge portion of the sky. It was unusual for Harry to draw anything like this, and I couldn't for the life of me work out what it was. "It's a big bird! And do you see those round splodges, Mummy, falling out of the sky? That's the bird's poop. It's falling onto the roof of our home. I made sure there was lots and lots of it." I raised a brow. "Bird poop? Why would you paint bird poop?" I asked. "I don't understand." "'Cause the bird is flying over our house. It's spraying our roof with lots and lots of poop, so we can be very lucky. Bird poop is lucky. You told me that, remember, when the bird pooped over the windscreen. You said it was very lucky." "Well, it is supposed to be lucky," I admitted. "I painted some bird poop as well, Miss Mackintosh," said Jack, who was sharing a table with Harry. "Everybody in the class painted bird poop in their paintings 'cause it's lucky. Harry told us it's lucky. Louise put splodges all over her picture as well, didn't she, Harry?" My son nodded in agreement. "Louise said she wanted to be very lucky, that's why." I examined Jack's painting. "Where is the bird poop?" I asked. "I don't see it anywhere." Jack pointed to a brown puddle on top of the roof of a tiny little house he'd painted in his picture. "This is it," he said proudly. "A bird sat on the roof, you see, and left behind a poop. So it's a lucky house. The bird marked it, you see." "That's very nice, Jack," I said. Jack looked very pleased with himself. "Over there in the far corner, Mrs. Mackintosh, is a lady beetle. Can you see it?" I squinted, narrowing my eyes, as little Jack pointed to a lady beetle in the picture that initially I thought was a dog wearing a red coat with black spots, as the lady beetle was so large in proportion to the house, rather like a cat or a dog. "That's a very big ladybug, isn't it, Jack?" I said. "That's because I want my picture to be very, very lucky, Miss Mackintosh," he said excitedly. "Ladybirds are lucky. I'm going to also paint a 4-leaf clover, but I'm going to make it into a tree in the yard, because 4-leaf clover is very lucky." "That sounds lovely, Jack," I said encouragingly, smiling at the child's enthusiasm, and the paint he'd managed to spray over his cute little heart-shaped face. The children in the nursery school were well behaved for children so young, and were all terribly enthusiastic about the lucky additions they had added to their paintings, in the form of bird poop, 4-leaf clovers, and lady beetles. I could not help but be rather amused that a little comment from my son about bird poop being lucky had meant the children had all added lucky symbols to their paintings. I was glad to send Jack to a nursery school like this, With such an interactive teacher like Mrs. Hancock, who genuinely adored the children in her charge, and even working long, tedious hours, did not appear to tire her in the least. Harry rarely enjoyed it at nursery, making papier-mâché pigs out of balloons, finger painting, colouring in, drawing, and playing all kinds of games with Lego blocks and school tricycles. He loved it all. I noticed that his interaction with the other kids had made him so much more confident these days. The first day I brought little Harry to the Peter Pan nursery school. He had been cowering behind my legs, clinging tightly to my dress, peeking behind me at the teacher, with fear etched in his eyes, as if he felt he was like a chicken being thrown into a den of wolves. He had burst into tears, refusing to leave me, but I left him there, alone at the nursery, feeling like a prize cad to abandon him like that. But it couldn't be helped. I had work to do. I had a living to make. But the very next day he was champing at the bit to get back to nursery, as kids are quick to adapt to a new environment, and in one day he claimed to have made tons of friends, and it would seem that he certainly had. The teacher, Mrs. Hancock, managed to help the children clear up all their paint, wash their brushes thoroughly, and clean up after themselves, so that they no longer had even a drop of paint left on them. I waited for the children to go, to get ferried away by their parents. Many arrived in dribs and drabs, while greetings were exchanged between us, as I knew the mothers and their children personally, from a plethora of birthday parties I had attended over the last year or so. Mrs. Hancock had invited me to have coffee with her. She wanted to have a little chat with me about Harry's progress. This was something she did with the parents from time to time, to help them keep abreast of things regarding their children. I really appreciated the one-on-one chats that I had with Mrs. Hancock, that she had with all the other parents. She was that kind of skillful teacher who was so passionate about her job and wanted the very best for all her pupils, so that once they went to kindergarten and beyond, they were in a good place emotionally, physically and mentally. On this occasion, all Mrs. Hancock could do was sing Harry's praises, and I know she meant every word of what she said. "He's a special little boy, Miss McIntosh, but I'm sure you know that only too well. Did you notice his influence over every kid in class this afternoon? They were all painting bird poop on their pictures. That was your son's influence. He was telling everybody about lucky symbols. So everybody wanted to paint ladybugs, four-leaf clovers, horseshoes, and bird poop." "But you forgot one thing," I said with a teasing smile. "I did," said Mrs. Hancock. "What is that, then?" "The black cat, of course. Everybody knows that when a black cat crosses your path, it's very good luck." Mrs. Hancock chuckled. "Why didn't I think about that one? No prizes for guessing what the children will be painting tomorrow afternoon. Black cats wearing four-leaf clover collars around their necks," she joked. "Sounds absolutely lovely," I said. "I've got so many of Harry's paintings all over my refrigerator. There isn't enough room to accommodate them all. I have to change them every week. He adores painting classes with you. And frankly, I'm amazed how expressive his paintings are for one so young." "Your son is terribly, terribly talented, Mrs. McIntosh. Sorry, Miss McIntosh. At just 5 years old, your son is a powerful influencer, as I was saying. When I think of the first day when he arrived here at the Peter Pan nursery, how demure he was back then. And look at him now. The contrast is amazing. That little cheerful boy has become the life and soul of the party. Oh, it is incredible. He has really blossomed at nursery, come out of his little shell. So he's in effect morphed from a frightened little crab into a brightly coloured angelfish. A metamorphosis of note, shall we say?" She chuckled. She continued, "At first I thought he would be the quietest, most bashful, restrained, reticent kid in my class. But that didn't last terribly long, did it? I would go so far as to say he's one of the most spirited kids here at the nursery. Harry's a very special boy, Miss McIntosh. You should be terribly proud of him. He knows his own mind. He's assertive. He's ambitiously attempting to do new things all the time, and will rise to every single challenge that presents itself. As for your son's paintings, They are particularly good, Miss Mackintosh, but I'm sure you've noticed that. So vibrant and bright, so expressive. He's a very advanced child for his age, you know, particularly bright and upbeat about everything. He doesn't discourage very easily. Nothing gets him down. And he's got a good heart on him, you know. The other day, for example, little Anna Thor fell over when she slipped over some juice that someone had spilt on the classroom floor. She grazed her knee and began to howl out in pain. It gave me the most dreadful shock. Anna Thor has got a mouth on her that is so loud it would make a foghorn seem mute. Truly, I thought something devastating had happened, that one of the kids was seriously injured. But thankfully it was a minor abrasion on her knee. "Oh dear," I said empathetically. "The day in the life of a nursery school teacher, I suspect. There's drama all around, is there not?" Mrs. Hancock laughed. "I do sometimes wonder why I signed up for it all. But I wouldn't have it any other way, you know, Miss Mackintosh. My life would be so dull without the children in it." "I know what you mean," I said. "When Harry came along, he brightened my life so much. I've never been the same since. Kids do that to you, don't they? They bring you back to life. Sorry, what were you saying about little Anna Thor?" Mrs. Hancock chuckled again. "Well, when Anna fell, little Harry gallantly ran over to her at once. He's so chivalrous for one so young. When he grows up, he's going to be a perfect gentleman, breaking hearts all over the place, I suspect. He was the first one to help her up on her feet again, and to stop her from crying. I heard him say, 'Don't worry, Anna, your knee may hurt now, but I promise you the hurt will go away soon. It always goes away.'" Little Anna had been sobbing her heart out like kids do when they hurt themselves, but Harry's kind words made the tears dry up at once. As I was saying, Miss Mackintosh, you've got a good one there. The kids in my nursery, many of them are reflections on how well they've been raised by their parents. Most of the children have two parents raising their children, Miss Mackintosh. So I commend you greatly for doing such a sterling job, being a single parent. It can't be easy for you raising little Harry all on your own, while making an income. It's highly commendable of you. I'm not sure I could do it myself, if the boot was on the other foot. I may be a married woman, Miss Mackintosh, but it may surprise you to know that I don't have children of my own, because I think of my kids as being here at the nursery school. I would be too exhausted to raise my own. I can imagine, Miss Hancock, with screaming kids all day. The last thing you need is to go home to screaming kids at night. I appreciate all the kind things you're saying about Harry, Mrs. Hancock. He's a good boy, and I am terribly proud of him. You're right. It hasn't been easy raising him single-handedly, I said, taking a sip of my steaming coffee. But then again, the best things in life are never easy, are they? They challenge you, and I think we all enjoy challenges, even though we might not be willing to admit that to ourselves. That's an excellent way to put it, Miss Mackintosh. Do you mind dreadfully if I ask you where Harry's father is? Is he in the picture or not? You don't have to tell me anything, of course. Tell me to mind my own business if you like. I do appreciate that people's lives are terribly private, and I, for one, do not want to intrude. But knowing more about my pupils helps me to understand them better, if you know what I mean. I shrugged my shoulders nonchalantly. I've got nothing to hide. I'm not embarrassed to discuss my private life with you, Mrs. Hancock. You can ask me anything you like. When it comes to Harry's father, there's not terribly much to say about the matter. I'm not in contact with him any more. Let's just say he was someone I dated for about 3 weeks, and the relationship went completely pear-shaped, rather quickly, I hasten to say. And when I discovered I was pregnant, and we had nothing in common, well, it was too late, wasn't it? I contacted him weeks later, telling him he'd made me pregnant, but he said that I was lying to him, and was after his money. And you know what I thought, Mrs. Hancock? Well, if that's your stinky attitude, I don't want you involved in my son's life anyway. Suffice to say, I've never heard from him since, nor do I actually want to. That ship has long since sailed, and I have no regrets about that at all. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Mackintosh. That can't be easy for you. But I do agree with your decision on that matter. I mean, with his deadbeat attitude. Why would you want him involved with Harry? He's better off without him, isn't he? I always encourage single mothers like yourself to bring a man into the fold, be it an uncle or a grandfather, to help the young boy in question receive that quintessential male bonding. Well, Harry does have my brother, his Uncle Marcus. The two of them get on like a house on fire, and Marcus is a powerful role model in his life. Well, that's very great to hear. How often does he see this Marcus, your son, I mean? About 3 times a week, I said. Marcus is not married, you see. He lives with me but works hard in building construction. He only gets home sometimes late in the evening, after spending time with friends, and after Harry has long since retired to bed. But he's a big part of little Harry's life. Definitely a good role model to him, even if he's out a lot and goes away from time to time. That is very good news to hear, Miss Mackintosh. It certainly allays my concerns. I'm glad to have spoken to you today. It has been a great pleasure. I like to know as much as I can about the pupils in my charge. As I was saying, you've got a special one with little Harry, Miss Mackintosh. He's my favourite child here at the Peter Pan Nursery School, and I don't say that lightly. It's not something I would say to everybody. But your son is turning out to be a very special little boy. I always say to parents that it's very important how they raise their children, because it influences the adults they will one day become. Not many people know that, Miss Mackintosh. Do you know they say that our personality develops between the ages of 3 and 6, which is why those are such impressionable years. When children are abused at that young age, sometimes they never fully recover from those traumatic experiences that can invariably scar them for life and affect their overall mental well-being as they get older. At this age, it's important to teach them compassion and to encourage our kids to share. I didn't know that, I said, but come to think of it, it makes an awful lot of sense. So there we are, that is the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.